Our goal in Ariel Ministries is to ultimately write a verse-by-verse commentary on all the books of the scriptures, and I'm focusing more and more on writings such as the major and minor prophets and things of that nature. Also some historical books. So one of these historical books is this one right here, a commentary on the book of Joshua. And the book of Joshua is the link between the closing of the 5 books of Moses when they still not entered the promised land, with book of Joshua when they entered the promised land, and then is the bridge over to the book of Judges. And the first 2 or 3 chapters of Judges is actually corresponding to the last few chapters of this book right here. And so that is the essence of the book. And the importance of the book is finally begins to show how Israel began to conquer the land. And it must be understood again by the golden rule of interpretation. When the plain sense of Scripture makes common sense, seek no other sense. It must also be interpreted on the basis of the context, because a text apart from its context is a pretext. The book of Joshua traces the period of time when they're still on the east side of the Jordan River, then deals with the details of crossing over the Jordan River, the observance of the first Passover within the Promised Land. Also the first Passover they've observed for 38 years because it was a 38-year period when they ceased to observe it. Also the mass circumcision of the whole Jewish nation, because those born in the wilderness after leaving Egypt were not circumcised. And so they needed to be circumcised before they could keep the Passover, because the Torah says no uncircumcised person should be allowed to eat the Passover. So there was a mass circumcision followed by the observance of the Passover, and then began the conquest of the land, beginning with the Jordan Valley by the conquest of Jericho, then moving into the hill country with the conquest of key cities there, and into the Shvelah region, the lowlands between the coastal plain and the mountain ranges. So at the time you get to the conquest finished, as far as they were intending to go, then what they did was, by the casting of lots, they began to divide the land and determine which tribe should get what portion of the land and how much territory within that portion will be their territory. Did not mean they conquered the whole land, as we shall see in a moment, but up until then, this was a national war that lasted for about 7 years. But now each tribe will have to be conquering the territory allotted to them. So it went from national war to tribal wars. Now, again, context is everything. So when you come to the end of chapter 11 of the book of Joshua, what you'll read there is that God they had conquered the whole land, and God gave to the Jewish people all the land that God had promised through Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the Abrahamic covenant. And if you stop to reading there, then you would conclude, well, all the land promises were already fulfilled. That's what replacement theology teaches, and that's how they interpret this book. They interpret it by that one verse, ignoring what else the book has to say. So since God already fulfilled all of the land promises to Israel, as he says in chapter 11, what that means is that there's no need for him to do anything more. And therefore, in their theology, there's no future restoration of Israel, there is no final regathering, and the church is now is fulfilling the Jewish covenants. They recognize it's not fulfilling it literally, so they say it's being fulfilled allegorically. And therefore, when you see the word Israel, it usually means the church, but they're very selective when it means that. Israel is the church when God says nice things about Israel. When God says bad things about Israel, well, that's them Jews again. That's a convenient interpretation, but it's not true to the wording of the text of Scripture. So yes, chapter 11 does say they conquered all the land. Then chapter 12 goes on to list all the kings that Joshua conquered. However, in chapter 13, he starts out telling Joshua there is still much land yet to be taken. And if you draw all the territory on the Middle East map, what you will notice is that most of the promised land was not yet taken. those for the tribes to take on from now on, which happens in the book of Judges. But if you just read the next chapter 13, it tells you all of the exceptions. And then it tells you what tribes got which territories. There are certain exceptions. For example, for the tribe of Judah, they did not take Jerusalem. At the time the book of Joshua was written, Jerusalem had not yet been taken. It was still a Canaanite city. And later on, same thing with Benjamin. They failed to take certain cities. And as you move into the first two chapters of Judges, that overlaps the book of Joshua, that this tribe failed to take these places, that tribe failed to take that places, so a lot of places were not conquered. So if you take the book literally, but also in context of the book itself, then you will see they didn't take all the land. Because after saying they took all the land, it says, now these are the exceptions, and they don't bother reading chapter 13 and beyond. And and then the book of Joshua, for example, Joshua dies. But then the first 2-3 chapters of Judges overlaps and Joshua is still living. When you get to the end of chapter 2, it clearly says, Joshua died and God did not give him all the land. So either you have a contradiction between what Joshua 11 says and what Judges chapters 2 and 3 teach. Then if you ignore that context, then you can go ahead and continue teaching replacement theology. But if you stay with the context of Joshua and then with related scriptures, which includes the first 2 or 3 chapters of Judges, you cannot teach that. Unless you say there's a contradiction, which a true evangelical would never conclude, then you will see you got to take every verse in its immediate context and then also in the wider context. Immediate context, what else did Joshua say? In the wider context, what does the book of Judges say? And then you'll realize there are exceptions. And the text says there are exceptions. So there's no contradiction to begin with. And that's the value of this book. A lot of other values as well, worth reading. But because we emphasize the Jewish frame of reference and taking it literally with related passages, that will make this commentary unique among others who would take the passages literally as well.